there had been signs that the military was plotting a takeover. There was a foiled coup attempt just last month. What were the events that led up to yesterday's ouster?
Well, as you said, there was a foiled coup attempt in September, and it seems with hindsight that that was a bit of a testing of the waters, and perhaps it was flushing out some of the elements of the military that were sympathetic to the civilian transitional government. It certainly laid the foundations for what was happening in the last 24, 48 hours. Last week, civilian forces came out in large numbers saying that they would protect the revolution, that they wouldn't allow for this impending military coup to happen. And it has happened. So, in a sense, the build-up was very clear, and it related to the fact that this sovereign council, a mixture of military elements, which back in 2019 were closely allied to President al-Bashir, but played a role in his deposal, alongside the revolutionary civilian forces of 2019, 2018, that really sought a transition to democracy. This was always an uneasy and unhappy marriage, and it started to really fall apart in recent months. And there was an ultimatum, really, to the military to step back from power and let the transition proceed. The military, in particular some security elements, were not happy about that.
Yeah, back in 2019, there was so much hope after the Sovereign Council was established, agreeing upon power sharing between the military and civilians. Do you think it's possible for the military to share power with civilian factions after what we've seen?
Well, that's right. I mean, that hope was born out of violence and despair. So you might recall, your viewers might recall, that President al-Bashir was deposed in April 2019, but it wasn't until about August of that year that proper transition to a mixed civilian military government was established. And that was on the back of desperate violence, because the protesters continued to protest after Bashir's deposal, saying, we don't want a transitional military council. We want civilian rule to be part of this transition. And they won that on the back of some really just drastic violence against civilian protesters. So that was the beginning of this transition. There was hope, but there was also a trepidation that this was not going to be an easy process of transition. Now it seems that, in effect, those beginnings have come to mark the ends, which is to say that the military, and especially some security elements around Burhan, not necessarily only Burhan, have decided that they've had enough with civilian elements within the government.
The international community threw its weight behind the Sovereign Council. Did diplomacy fail here?
I think diplomacy has had a hard time catching up with these realities. This transition was always precarious from the outset, and then suddenly made so much more precarious by the global pandemic, by a distraction of energy and effort. The events in Ethiopia, in the region, really, sharpening the attention there. And so it was quite, I think, in a sense, difficult for the international elements and diplomats to keep the necessary engagement and focus that they had to. At the same time, I think some clear mistakes have been made. There was an attempt to reform the Sudanese economy right in the midst of a precarious transition. That involved, the reform of macroeconomics elements in the economy, which subsidized bread for civilians. You remove that, it makes it even harder for civilians to believe in the transition as a positive thing. Now, those kinds of efforts and energies towards reform have also played into the hands of military elites who have felt that these uncertainties give them a card to play against the civilian government.